So there was two things that really prompted this talk, and I was happy to be invited. One is to introduce to my sort of behavior-based colleagues what we think is a pretty practical way to apply what Tom Gilbert talked about philosophically as accomplishment-based performance improvement. This is going to be a very high-level overview of how we approach it and a little bit how it developed. And the other thing is, as Kent said, to shed maybe a little light on one way of thinking about micro-credentialing or modular skill and competency development, if you will. So with that, let me, this probably needs to be turned on. Where is the switch? Yeah, I know it is, but it's, oh, there we go, it worked. Okay, so here's, except it skipped just a second. Yeah, it's a little delayed. Okay, anyway, so just as sort of background, there's a few QR codes in this, which you can get them on the recording probably. If anybody's interested, you can point your phone at them now, but I tried to include other resources. This is an article that's relevant. I published it in TD magazine last summer, which is not my favorite organization, the Association for Talent Development, but it goes to hundreds of thousands of people around the world who are involved in talent development. And this is an approach in general to talent development, all the way from hiring really to succession planning and everything in between, that's sort of outlined in it, and it's quite relevant to this session. This is a detailed picture, but what I wanted to do is give you sort of an overview of what I'm going to do. I want to talk about how we anchor performance analysis to valuable accomplishments, as Tom Gilbert would say, and then also talk about how we've sort of gone from the three-term contingency through Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model to what we now call the 6 boxes model. I want to talk a little bit about so-called training, which really, if training is not done with the other things needed to support performance, you're not going to get the return on investment that you need. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. And then talk about training design and talent development and performance improvement based on accomplishments. And then focus in a little bit on learning objectives as not you will be able to do or know, but you will be able to produce. That is an objective for a training program or module being accomplishment-based. Give you some examples from both, I think one of them is from a call center, having nothing to do with our field, and then a couple of examples from ABA. And then some sort of ideas about possible accomplishment-based certification. So these 4 gentlemen were all mentors of mine and huge influences on this work. And of course, Dr. Skinner influenced all of us. And there's a lot of things he brought to me, but I think what I learned mostly from him when I got very excited about Walden 2 and wrote him a fan letter was that the natural science that he created gave us a way to improve anything that involves behavior, education, therapy, management, you name it. And then following on that, I was given actually a copy of Tom Gilbert's Human Competence about 1980, a couple years after it was published. And when I started to get involved in organizations with Og Lindsley's kind of kick in the pants to do that, the notion of performance engineering became kind of clear and important to me. And the models that I'm going to talk to you about are really based on Tom's work, but they're an effort to take what I think was essentially a philosophy book, Human Competence, and make them more actionable. And then Joe Harless, who I'll bet almost nobody in this room has ever heard of, but Joe was probably the most important protege of Tom Gilbert. And he created an accomplishment-based approach to performance analysis and what he called accomplishment-based curriculum development that was very detailed and job-aided down to the last nit. And he was also a teacher of mine. He used to say before he passed, he said, I want to watch your experiment, because as you'll see, we use very simple models in a flexible way of thinking about performance, whereas he job-aided it down to the last step, which helps to adopt in large organizations, but got in some people's way because they was like, this is too much. But Joe was a big influence. And then Ogden, who was really my professional father in the end. And he brought a lot to the table, as everybody here knows. But I think the 2 things that are relevant to this are, one, measurement. We can count stuff, and we'll talk about that. But really, the plain English component was the most important part, as you'll see, because what he said is if we're going to parachute behind enemy lines, as he used to kind of talk about it, we need to be able to use language that our audiences will understand. And the people I work with have no background mostly in behavior analysis. They're ordinary managers, leaders, and so forth. So we need to make things simple and easy to use. So these were big influences in this work. Now, to sort of frame this whole thing, what I would say is if we're having anything to do with performance, leaders, managers, performance professionals, including trainers or HR people or whatever, we need to have good, crisp answers to these three questions. They may seem obvious, but they're not so obvious if you ask a group. First of all, what is human performance? What are the elements of it? And if I ask you all, you would say some combination of things, probably behavior producing results, or maybe organizational improvement related to people's activity, whatever. There'd be a lot of different language. And so what we need is well-defined elements, and we have what we call the performance chain, which is our model for describing that. And then what influences performance? And of course, people in this room know about the three-term contingency, maybe plus motivating operations and so forth. But I think Tom Gilbert gave us a model, which when translated, the behavior engineering model, into plain English is very powerful. And then let's say we have answers for those first two. What do we do with it? How do we analyze, improve, and manage performance? And so I want to take you through these things one step at a time. So what is human performance? Well, Tom really laid down a foundation for what is really a paradigm shift. And he said Tom was a kind of an iconoclastic, brilliant man. You know, he liked to poke you in the eye when he could. And he said in the great cult of behavior, behavior itself is viewed as an end rather than as a means to an end. Now, he didn't mean us behaviorists. He meant everybody, leaders, managers, trainers, you name it. But then he said, we must enable people to produce accomplishments, the valuable products of behavior. Now, this is like scripture in the International Society for Performance Improvement, where people talk about human performance technology. But what I've learned over the last 30 or 40 years is that in that organization or that community, as well as among our OBM colleagues who talk about accomplishments, the meaning of that word is a little fuzzy. Some people talk about business results, what I would call business results. Some people talk about small deliverables. Some people talk about the completion of behavior. And so maybe 25 years ago, I coined the phrase work outputs, because I don't really want to argue with anybody about what accomplishments means, but I want to be precise. And so that phrase, which other people have used similar phrases, but first of all, it's the product of work, if we're in an organization. And secondly, notice it's plural, outputs. So they're countable things, as we'll see in a minute. So this was kind of laid the foundation. Now, what I would argue is if you're defining performance, if you want to answer that first question, there's basically three elements. There's behavior that produces work outputs or accomplishments that are valuable to the extent that they contribute to organizational or business results. Now, I used to always say, and you'll see some of my slides say business results, and I mostly work with companies. But in some not-for-profits, people don't really like to be thought of as businesses, so I'll say organizational results. But what's important is results that reflect the success of the whole organization. So I like to use, examples from sports because people sort of get that when they're talking about performance. And since we work with people around the world, soccer is probably the best choice. So this young lady, if this were animated, you'd see she's behaving, right? She's kicking the ball. Now, what is it she's trying to produce? A goal, right? A ball in the net. Now, she might be kicking it to a teammate who's heading it into the net, but that's what they want. That's the countable accomplishment or output. And why is it valuable? Well, it's valuable because it contributes to winning the game. And if it's, in the park, it's just a team. But if it's a professional organization, it's actually a business result. And what we say with these three elements is that behavior, as we all know, is action. We use verbs to describe it. Work outputs are things. They're countable things. We define them with nouns, no verbs allowed. And I wind up doing a lot of corrective feedback around that sometimes. And then when we talk about organizational results, as I mentioned, the focus we have is on those that reflect success of an organization in accomplishing its mission. So, for example, we might have process cycle time or other things down inside of an organization, but I would keep asking why. And we'd eventually get to answers like customer satisfaction, quality, operational efficiency, profits. So that's the level of organizational results we're always trying to think about. So that leads to our first simple model, the performance chain. And as you see from the subtitle, we say this depicts how behavior produces organizational or business results, and has these elements. And it works from left to right, and we analyze it from right to left, starting with the end in mind. And we anchor it in work outputs or accomplishments. And the reason we do that is because that's the value. That's the value that is being contributed, as Tom Gilbert pointed out. Now, he had a very interesting kind of little equation here. He talked about the worth of an intervention. And what he said was the worth of an intervention, whether it's a training program or some coaching thing or a new system or whatever it is, it should be calculated or at least thought of as the value of the accomplishments that that intervention, whatever it is, allows us to improve or add to the pot, divided by the cost for behavior. And he pointed out that behavior is costly. It's not valuable in its own right. It's only valuable to the extent that it produces something of value. Now, if you reflect on things that maybe you've even been participants in, like training programs, for example, money spent on developing and creating the training program, people taken away from their jobs, people sitting in the room for X number of hours, whatever it is, versus maybe a set of job aids that could be used on the job with some good expectations and feedback, you say, there might be a difference in the worth of these two interventions. And of course, in current parlance, we'd talk about that as return on investment. So I don't emphasize the quantitative analysis using this framework, although you can do it. But I do emphasize it conceptually because we're trying to enable people to produce accomplishments. And what's the most cost-effective combination of things we can do to enable that to happen? Now, another thing about accomplishments or work outputs is that they help us connect day-to-day activity or behavior with organizational results. So, for example, that stupid little session note that you have to write a lot if you're a behavior tech. It's like, oh, geez, another one of these. However, if it's good, it will contribute probably to regulatory compliance, to possibly revenue, to perhaps not getting in trouble when they do the next audit. So the behavior of writing in a certain way may or may not be a big deal. But if you say to this person, look, this thing is really important, so let's get it right, it connects them up with the success of the organization. And you can say that about virtually any output that a person can have. And people like knowing how they contribute. So that's just an interesting part of the accomplishment-based thing. Now, I mentioned Joe Harless earlier, and he had a thing he cleverly called ABCD, accomplishment-based curriculum development. And he worked in a lot of large organizations. He introduced this, and the notion was conceptually, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later, but you start out with, let's say, a job title or a process that people are running, and then you look at the accomplishments, and you may break them down, and then you look at the tasks and the steps, and you figure out what people need to do to produce that thing, whatever it is. And so this was the rationale that he introduced to me probably 30 years ago, and sort of took me on this path. Now, one of the cool things about Joe's approach, which was, as I mentioned earlier, job-aided down to the last detail, is that you could introduce it into large organizations in a consistent way. So, for example, the Coast Guard adopted his methodology. Boeing did. Some other companies did. So that's kind of important to give credit to Joe, but also because that's kind of the way of thinking that you'll see all play out here. Now, I've mentioned outputs or accomplishments. Like, how do we find them? Well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're working, for example, on a job title or an individual's performance, all the way from hiring to onboarding to training to ongoing coaching to possibly making decisions about compensation and promotion, even to succession planning, you'll look at the outputs that job is expected to produce, and you can drive every single one of those phases focusing on accomplishments. Or if you're looking at a process, of which there are zillions of processes in most organizations, you can look at each of the steps in that process and you can figure out what they're supposed to produce, and those are the outputs to work on. Or, as in a lot of the organizations I work in, I go in and there's training groups, and they want to become performance consultants. They want to expand the scope of their work. And so in that case, what we say is, well, let's define the objectives of your training program as, at the end of this training program, you'll be able to produce X, and then we put the rest of the things in place that will support it on the job. Or change management and implementation. What is the thing we're trying to change to, whatever it is? What are the outputs of that? and let's drive and sustain change to that. Cultural interventions, which I'm not going to talk much about, but I published a thing a few years ago in JOBM that's relevant. If you start out with outputs and you recognize that a given value statement, organizational value statement, might look different in customer service than in IT, than in operations, you can look at the outputs, tweak the criteria for those outputs based on the value statement, and then you can enable people to apply the values in their particular ways in their part of the organization. And finally, in sales performance, where I've done a lot of work, there's a lot of milestones. There's things like appointment with the chief operating officer, request for proposal, proposal itself. Those are all outputs, and that's another place we find them. So here's some other stuff. Our resource library, which has some white papers, and also the YouTube channel, which has as of last week, 51 recorded webinars on it. Now here's an example, just to give you a little bit of the tools, of what we call an individual performance map. So this is an individual performance map for that individual or that role, the sales director. Around the sales director in the boxes are their recipients or customers of their outputs, and then we can talk about their outputs. So this is a very nice way to define a whole job. Simple looking job, but not quite the same as a clinical supervisor, BCBA. You probably can't even read that. But this is, at least in a particular organization, the entire job of a clinical supervisor, defined in terms of outputs. So you can use this tool to define the jobs of an individual for coaching, but also of a job role. In processes, we have steps, obviously. Now, a lot of process people are real clear about the steps, which would be in the white boxes on this picture, the behavior. But not everybody defines the outputs of each step. They tend to be really good at knowing what the final process is supposed to produce. But I've worked with some pretty sophisticated, like Six Sigma and process improvement people, and they say one of the value adds that we bring to the table is being sure that from each step we know what the output is, because you can diagnose and measure a lot better that way. Now, there's lots of processes in ABA organizations, countless ones. We have a list of something like 60 or 70. But as in most organizations, they aren't always documented. They often aren't even named. But let's just pick one, client intake and placement. Here's a process map, and expanding on it, that a colleague of mine did working in one of the larger ones. And the white boxes are the steps. And she put the little purple boxes as the outputs. So for example, submit treatment plans to authorizations team, and from that you get the plan ready for a funder authorization. So this is a nice way to think about outputs of each step in a process. So that's what is performance? It's behavior that produces accomplishments that contribute to organizational results. Okay, now what's the second question? What influences performance? Well, you guys all know this. Discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses that hopefully are followed by reinforcing stimuli, or maybe not, punishing stimuli, and maybe there's some motivating operations thrown in there. But this is the simple three-term contingency framework. And I still can't remember if it was Aubrey Daniels or Og Lindsley, but whoever it was that sort of plain Englished this a little bit as antecedents, behavior, and consequences. But Tom Gilbert recognized that we're not pigeons or rats, and that in the laboratory for pigeons and rats, we build the manipulanda for that organism. But that software wasn't built for you. Those tools weren't built for you. So what he recognized was, if we expand on the three-term contingency, we can look at what the environment or the organization provides, the information needed to know what you're trying to accomplish and how you're doing, which he called data, the instruments, which is a sort of a funky word for it, but it means the things that you use while you're performing, and the incentives, which was his word for consequences. But the individual needs knowledge or skills, and you either select them based on that, or you have to enable them to have those. He used the word capacity to refer to the individual's capacity. How good of a fit are they for whatever the job or task is? And then motives were really his way, I think, of thinking about functional definition of reinforcement, of consequences. So if you don't like Hawaii or the sun or the ocean, probably the trip to Hawaii isn't going to be a big incentive for you, as a simple example. So the trouble with that model, because I glommed onto it in about 1980, 81, and then I got to know Tom, and he was a great person to talk to and get some feedback from and stuff. But what I realized was, if you look at this model, the language was actually confusing to people. People said, data? Like, what is that? Is that like spreadsheets? Or what is that? Or instruments, sounds like a violin or an ohm meter, or what is that? So the language caused trouble, and when we started to share it with our clients, especially, who were not kind of nerdy performance improvement people like we were, they were like, well, they were confused. So I spent quite a few years between about mid-'80s and the end of the '80s tweaking the language and testing it with people. And that's when we came up with this language. And what we found was, we can go into great detail on that. QR code will take you to a whole webinar about this. But what we found was that people don't make category errors with this. They kind of get it. We can put it in reports and we can talk about expectations and feedback, and people don't say, well, what does that mean? They know what it means. And so the language works really well for people. And what I would propose is that there's not a single thing that I know of that influences behavior that is not encompassed either by these cells or the links between them. So this is what we came up with is what influences performance. And this is not a big deal, but a few years ago at the ISPI conference, unbeknownst to me, somebody ran a session where they were nominating and voting for the best performance model in the world, and guess what won? I think the reason it won is because it's practical. That's and plain English. But anyway, let's start to move then toward thinking about training. If we just do skills and knowledge, if we just do training or do what I sometimes cynically refer to as spray and pray, we're not going to get a lot of payoff. On the job, we need to have managers and supervisors setting expectations, providing fairly frequent feedback. We want to be sure that the tools that people are using, whether it's documents or software or having people that they can turn to, any of that, we want to be sure that it's accessible and works. We want to be sure that the consequences work, although my emphasis has been consistently for years, I'm not a big fan of extrinsic consequences except in the beginning. What I really like is to arrange all those other conditions so people make contact with the natural payoff of doing their job well. But, that's depends on the situation. And then selecting and assigning people for the job and being sure that we understand not only what their consequences, how that works for them, which ones work, what their reinforcers are, but also maybe how they like their expectations to be set, what tools work for them, and at a broader level, what the values are that they espouse, because we want to be sure that they line up with our organization. My stupid joke about that is if you hire a person to be a behavior tech who could have worked at Starbucks, but it's kind of a long drive, so they're going to work for you as an ABA company, that might not be the best choice for retaining them. It might be you want somebody who explicitly want to help kids or disabled people. So that's the framework. Now, as I said, if you don't address the other factors here, it's like planting seeds and not watering them. You're probably not going to sustain. You're going to have this problem of lack of sustainment, maybe even lack of retention of people. And so if we're talking about return on investment, first of all, we want to be sure that expectations and feedback are consistent and that on the job, there's also consistent expectations and feedback. We want to be sure that the tools and resources are actually easy to use, that people aren't struggling against the process and working around it. We want to be sure that, again, consequences are available and they can actually apply what they learned, and there's a good payoff for that, either natural consequences or extrinsic. We certainly want to be sure that they have skills and knowledge, but as the kind of person who's been promoting fluency-based instruction for a long time, we know very well that if we don't get people fluent, it's probably not going to retain. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult. And then we want to, of course, have a good fit, and we want to be sure that people not only are encountering consequences that they care about and they're getting feedback and such in a way that works for them, but again, also that the values align. So we have tools like this, which is an analysis tool for actually asking people in the cells, how they're doing, what's working, what's not doing. But that's basically how we think about what influences performance. So then, okay, what do we do with that? How do we approach that? Well, we paste the two models together, and we have a thing we call performance improvement logic. We say, in any situation, whether it's a supervision or coaching conversation or some big, hairy 3-year project or something in between, we want to know what's at stake. Like, why are we doing this? Are we doing this for client satisfaction or regulatory compliance or quality? What is it? Because that will help shape the rest of it. Once we know those organizational level results that we care about in this context, then we take a look at the hunk of performance, whether it's a role or a process or the things we want to change and implement. But we want to be sure that the outputs actually do contribute to business results, or we should probably get rid of them. And we want to be really clear what they are. The cool thing about that is once we know what the outputs or accomplishments are, it's pretty straightforward to go with the behavior. You can do a task analysis, you can observe successful performers, you can observe exemplary performers, as Tom Gilbert would have us do, but there's no mystery here. It's what's the behavior that will produce those outputs. And as my former partner used to point out, wonderful phrase, outputs in some respects liberate behavior. Now, we wouldn't want to be liberating behavior in a nuclear plant. You know, we kind of have to follow the procedures. But in a lot of environments, finding innovative ways to produce the accomplishment more effectively is a good thing. So if we focus on the output, we've got to anchor for that. Then, one of the interesting things is there's really only 3 things in this framework that we can measure. We can measure business results, which typically are lagging indicators, but we probably are going to be measuring them anyway if we're in a company or organization. We can measure behavior, and we all know how to do that in various ways. And we can usually count outputs that meet criteria. So it's a very nice measurement framework. So we can think about what are we going to measure here? Then we get to the 6 boxes, and we do a little design thinking. We first of all do some observation and analysis, and we figure out in each of those cells what's working, what's not working, what's an obstacle, what's an enabler, what's missing. So that's the analyze part. We have a different ABC, as you might have noticed. Then we brainstorm. We get people to really think, this sounds really stupid, but sort of outside of the box for these things. We want to maybe come up with some ideas that we might not implement, but we don't want to just focus on the usual suspects, you know? And then ideally with our clients or our stakeholders, we choose the best combination. And so this is the logic that we teach, and it's very flexible. Once we have that, we then implement. And probably everybody in this room knows you don't usually get it all the first time. In fact, one of our clients at Amgen, they did a really cool thing. Some people might know the acronym ADDIE, Analysis, Design, Development, Implementation, Evaluation. They had this thing at our Summer Institute a few years ago where one of their senior people said, we added the S to ADDIE for ADDIES for sustainment. And they have when they do a project internally, and they've done hundreds of projects, we've got 350 certified performance thinking practitioners at Amgen. They will have a kind of informal or maybe slightly formal contract with their client or their stakeholder. They say, look, after we implement 6-8 weeks, whatever the reasonable time is, we're going to come back and do a quick and dirty 6 boxes analysis, because guaranteed we'll discover some stuff that wasn't working. So we'll tweak it. And that provides for the continuous improvement kind of approach. And then, because of the plain Englishness of it, we also, in the process, share with our stakeholders and clients this language. And so by the end of a project, we've usually got just regular folks that are involved kind of talking about expectations and such. They don't even know they're adopting a language. It just becomes part of how they think about stuff. And we can, I don't need to belabor this, but you can use a standard chart in any of those things. You can chart behavior or work outputs or business results. And also, as I mentioned already a little bit, accomplishments are actually easier to measure. Because if you define what a good treatment plan, relationship, widget, proposal, whatever the thing is, the accomplishment is, if you define the criteria for a good one, you can count the ones that meet criteria. And it's a lot easier than trying to measure behavior in many cases. So, and we can measure it at different levels, and there's a whole lot that can be said about that. But it's another advantage to being accomplishment-based. And as I mentioned, and this goes to that article I suggested at the very beginning, every stage in talent development can be built on accomplishments. We can have onboarding where we decide what people need to be up to speed on the first day, the first week, the first month, et cetera, et cetera. We can, at every stage in there, including ongoing coaching and supervision, say, okay, what are we going to talk about today, RBT? Well, how about those, how about your data sheets? Completed data sheets. Let's see if we can improve that, whatever it is. So everything in talent development can be accomplishment-based. Now, zeroing in on training a little bit, this is kind of where I want to go with this. One of the things is, if you think about the job of leaders, managers, and supervisors, and the reason we developed a coaching program and management programs is because there's a lot more of them than there are of us, right? So, the notion of performance improvement people kind of parachuting into an environment, doing some magic and then taking off probably ain't gonna work. We need to partner with these people. And if you talk to some, like, for example, new managers, used to do a lot of work at Microsoft, and you talk to these engineers, who've been promoted to management. First of all, sometimes they don't really want to manage. They just want to do the work themselves. But more importantly, they often think they're supposed to be the smartest person on the team. And they may or may not be, but that ain't it. Their job is to arrange conditions for the people that they lead or manage to be optimally productive and engaged, both. Because if we use aversive control and get them to be productive, they're probably not going to stick around for a long time. So those are both important characteristics. And so we need to arrange conditions for employees to be productive and engaged. And so one of the nice things in training is if we use work outputs as our learning objectives, if we say at the end of this program or module, you'll be able to produce whatever the thing is. First of all, they define when the behavior is successful. You know when it's done what it's supposed to do. Secondly, as I mentioned, kind of implied earlier, we can take training, which teaches people how to do a good session note, how to do the stuff required to improve, let's say, a relationship with a kid, how to be sure that the materials are arranged properly, how to produce charts that are up to date, whatever the outputs are. Those transfer directly to things that you have to produce on the job. So it's not like we're going to teach you a bunch of things to do over here and then you're going to have to figure out how to apply it. You're actually learning how to produce the thing. And I think that could apply in micro-credentialing as well. It's also, as I mentioned, easier to measure. It sort of leads naturally, as I mentioned also again earlier, to the behavior. We can do task analysis and observe successful performers. And I already mentioned the work outputs liberate things. So, and then there's another thing that's interesting too, which is if you observe successful performers, really expert performers doing something, and a lot of times there's a lot of unconscious competence. We all have that in this room probably. And if you say, okay, make a decision based on this spreadsheet, Mr. VP of Sales, but tell me how you're looking at the spreadsheet as you do it, instead of just looking at them and saying, oh, you should do this. Could you talk through what's going on? You can capture a lot of covert behavior, which then becomes part of your exemplary behavior analysis. So those are some big advantages. Something I only recognized recently is I used to say, how many people know Robert Mager's behavioral objectives? It's pretty common, big influence. And I knew Bob pretty well. He's quite a character, but he, I always think, well, he was doing behavioral objectives, we need accomplishments. But when I went back and looked at a lot of the examples of Magerized objectives, they often actually had the output in them. So this example, using Microsoft Excel, the learner will create a bar chart for a given data that matches a provided example. So they've actually got the output built into this. So if you're going to have behavioral objectives, have the output explicit in it too, is one suggestion. Now here's some examples. This is actually, on the left, the things that are in orange there have verbs in them. These are kind of behavioral objectives. Explain a bioreactor inoculation process, use Microsoft Excel, etc. On the right, we got outputs. So we can usually take behavioral objectives, figure out what the behavior is supposed to produce, and make a very explicit output at the end of that. Now, these are hard to look at probably, but here's an example from a customer service environment. We did some work at AT&T Wireless years ago, and the main output that customer service reps have to produce is solutions or answers for the people on the phone, often while the people are yelling in their ears, of course. But so this is a whole framework for that. Both during training and on the job, we need to be sure that the supervisors set the same expectations, that there's an expectation, for example, we discovered from one exemplary performer, I don't end the call until I can hear them smiling. That was an interesting little bit we found. Ask also, the expectation set, be sure at the end to ask if there's any more you can do to help them. Be sure to use visible data display in the call center space for feedback, etc. Now, the things that you see in each of those cells are a full system that you implement both as part of your developing people in so-called training and on the job. The things that are in blue, I highlighted because being a fluency guy, those are places where fluency makes a difference. And very often, tools and resources, like you need easy to use stuff. You know, at Amgen at one point, I remember they have all these standard operating procedures, SOP documents, but they were like in a book away from the people who were supposed to be using. It was like, come on, man, bring it over to the person who's operating the equipment so they can look it up if they need to. And if they look it up, be sure it's been user tested so it actually works. So there's a fluency component in the tools and resources piece. There often is in the expectations and feedback part, and certainly when you're training, you want to pull out the components and provide practice. We sort of know that if we have any influence about, you know, from precision teaching or fluency-based instruction. This is just some data from the article. The black dots are the number of solutions per hour after our training, and the open dots are the ones after the conventional training, and they actually decelerated. We actually were able to, with that sort of framework I just showed you, go from 2 months to 2 weeks to getting new customer service reps up to speed. Now, if we move into the ABA world, what I did is I looked up some things about what are the most frequent negative audit findings in ABA organizations, and this is some of them. Generic treatment plans that are not tailored to the client, treatment goals that don't align with the billing codes, et cetera. You can read them. So let's pick one. How about treatment goals that not aligned with billing codes? Well, here's a framework for that. And what you see is we have written steps for doing it. We have the supervisor modeling how you define these things. You have some reminders in the 3-ring about, be sure to remember to check this out. You have maybe a decision table which helps them go through based on the billing codes, et cetera, in box 1. You got some box 2 things, which include some software you might be using that you better be fluent at, and it better be built for fluency. You want to have some consequences. And of course, in skills and knowledge, we want to have some practice. So you can read the details, but the point is it's more than just skills and knowledge. And here's another example, session notes, incomplete session notes. Well, you can do the same kind of thing for that. But again, down in skills knowledge, for sure, we want to provide some discrimination practice about good ones and not so good ones. We want to fix ones that aren't good. We want to practice using the software, whatever it is, for creating the notes. We might even have some cards where we practice good, sorting good ones from bad ones. But it's not just box 4. It's the other variables that also make a difference. So my proposal would be, if you start thinking about modular training, whether it's for micro-credentials or some other purpose, if you start out with outputs and then you think about the full set of variables that need to be in place, be sure that those bridge from the training, so-called, into the job environment so it's consistent. I hope that makes sense. That's the really high-level sort of pitch for this, but it's just so much easier to do instructional design when you start out with the outputs. So here's some examples, some possible training and certification objectives. I think I even captured this from some of the work that Kent and colleagues here are doing on micro-certification. But all those orange things are things. They're all accomplishments. Even things like relationships. Now, we did a session in our Summer Institute a few years ago about relationships as valuable accomplishments. And the initial response people have a little bit is like, well, that's kind of robotic. That sounds kind of weird. But think about it. In your personal and professional life, relationships are among your most important things that you work to develop and maintain. And the exercise that we take people through, it's kind of fun to do, is we say, just list all the relationships you have, both professionally or personally, whatever, that working relationships, let's say. And now, without overthinking, check off the ones that are really good. And they do, and there's always some that aren't so really good. And then you say, think about the characteristics of those relationships, each one that makes them good. And people can usually come up with that. And now you say, let's figure out those ones that you said aren't good and what we can do to help improve them. So you can actually go through the same kind of process of defining the accomplishment, figuring out what the criteria are, and then, building to that. So this is a little bit of a kind of a testimonial, but Karen Reed, who's had a growing ABA company, actually a set of different programs in Florida, she said after she'd been working with this stuff for a few years, and the context for this is that she left the business for about 6 months because her father was dying, and she came back and her management team were sort of holding people accountable and doing a lot of the traditional stuff that they thought they should do. But after they then started saying, every time we have a people problem, we look at it through the lens of accomplishments in the 6 boxes, over the first few months of her being back, she said, performance thinking has had a measurable impact on my company. In fact, at our summer institute, she said, you guys saved my company. I said, this sounds like an exaggeration to me. And then this is what she said. She said, our staff retention rate has increased immensely. New applicants tell us that they hear we're the preferred place to work. Employee satisfaction engagement have increased. It helped us move from being a struggling company to one with the tools to overcome any performance. So I'm not pitching this necessarily really, but it's an example of how if you take a systematic approach, if it's accomplishment-based, and if you look at the full 6 boxes, you can make a pretty big difference. So here's some takeaways. First of all, by defining the accomplishments of a job or a process or of the thing you want to be true once you do an implementation planning thing, you can go rather directly to the behavior. So it's the best way, from my perspective, to define what behavior is actually important. Second thing is, this is kind of the slightly nicer way of saying that outcomes or outputs or accomplishments liberate behavior. Accomplishments are relatively stable usually, but behavior can improve or change, or you can figure out different ways to do it. I was talking in an earlier session with people about you introduce a new system, a new software system, and you're still producing treatment plans and session notes and various other things, but you got to change the behavior to produce those. So that's a classic example of that kind of thing. It also, for that reason, allows for innovation in behavior. You know, John just discovered a better way to do that. Maybe we should try that. You know, you're still producing the same thing, but you're doing it in a better way, more efficient way. And then what I would say is that if you're trying to train people, and I use the word train with kind of quotation marks because I don't really think you can just do training in isolation. If you're trying to develop people and you focus on accomplishments, then it directly moves into the work environment if those accomplishments are either the whole thing or maybe they're sub-outputs of, like, for example, you look at a treatment plan. There's a lot of sections in that. Or you look at a business proposal. There's a lot of sections, and each one of those might be a different kind of output, and there may be different behavior for producing them and different behavior influences. But it chunks up the performance in a very nice way. And there's really nothing lost by taking this approach, and it's all kind of value add. So just as this is free, so I'm not selling anything here, but if you go to Performance Thinking TV, which is our YouTube channel, I started it during COVID when business kind of took a hit, and so I had time to do this. We've got 51 one-hour-long webinars on that thing. We've been doing it for 4 years. So if you're interested in any of this, I'm sure there's something you can find in there, and there's a couple of them either even on ABA and supervision and such. So check it out. And then there's a lot more free resources, but we also do have our program, which I don't want to emphasize because this is not a sales pitch. But these are some places you can get more information. And the QR code down there actually goes to my calendar. So this maybe is a pitch, but if you want to talk about more feedback or other stuff about what I've talked about here, if you point your phone at that when you have some time or in the recording, either way, it goes to my calendar and you can find a time that works for you. So we've got 4 minutes and 8 seconds. Any comments or questions, anyone? Yes, can you go over by the microphone so they can record it, please?
Just wondering what you think, how AI might factor into your model.
Good question. So I was just at the International Society for Performance Improvement Conference like a month ago, and that was everybody was talking about it. Now, a lot of it was just talking about what is AI and stuff, and my big enlightenment about that was, oh, we're large language models ourselves. We should, but beside that, I started playing around with it a little bit. And so, for example, I just went to ChatGPT and I said, give me a list of 100 things that set expectations in the work environment. Whoosh, gave me 100 things categorized by types of things. It's like, holy cow, I couldn't come up with that list myself. So at least in the brainstorming thing, and you could do the same, you could probably correct descriptions. Like, I spend a lot of time when I'm coaching people taking their supposed descriptions of accomplishments that have verbs in them and saying, no, you got to get rid of the verbs. So at a minimum, as an idea generator and also as an editor, I think it's useful. But I think we can go a lot further than that, and it's just baby steps right now with AI. I'm pretty sure we're going to be able to dramatically accelerate the ability of people to analyze and design improvements for performance, especially given the simplicity of our language. If we tried to do it with a big, hairy performance systems model or stuff, it's like, whoa, there's a lot of stuff. But the elements of our models make it pretty easy to categorize stuff. So I'm actually excited about that, but I've only started to poke into it a little bit. Anybody else? We got a couple minutes? And I'm also happy to talk in the hall and everything if anybody's interested. All right, well, thank you so much. It's fun to have this opportunity.